Now, there are several different ways to study the seven churches. You can look at them from a historical perspective, because these seven churches were literal churches that actually existed, and if you had lived in the first century AD, you could have visited these actual churches. So we could study this from a historical perspective. Or you could study it from a prophetical perspective. These seven churches, with seven being God's perfect number, seven being the biblical number of completion, seven giving us a complete, perfect revelation of what God is doing throughout history in His church, and how it all began in the days of the apostles with Ephesus, and how it will all conclude 7 churches later in the days of apostasy with the lukewarm church of Laodicea. Or we can study these 7 churches from a personal viewpoint and read these 7 letters. As we study through them, each of us must notice that 7 times at the conclusion of these letters, the Lord will say, "And he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." So that means if we have ears, these letters are for us. And these are personal messages that God has for each and every one of us. Because you see, in each of these 7 churches, we have represented the 7 kinds of Christians who make up the 7 churches. Did you know that? Yeah. These 7 churches represent 7 different types of church members that are in every Christian church congregation. And in every church, there are some Ephesian Christians. And in every congregation, there are some Smyrna Christians. And in every church congregation, there's some Pergamos Christians and some Thyatira Christians and some Sardis Christians and some Philadelphian Christians. And believe it or not, in every church congregation, there are some Laodicean Christians. And each of us needs to sincerely pray as we study these 7 churches that God will speak to our heart and that we will be able to honestly answer the question as we proceed in this series: what kind of a Christian am I? Am I a Ephesian Christian? And I've lost my first love that I once had for the Lord? Am I a Thyatira Christian where I've let my once sacred relationship with Jesus now become just loose and worldly? And just right on down the line. And friend, as we go from week to week now and from this series, from church to church, from letter to letter, I want you to ask yourself this question: what church do I fit into? What kind of Christian am I? Do you see where we're heading in this series? That's one more way that we can look at these 7 churches that we're going to spend a great deal of time on the next 8 weeks. And that's by looking at them from a current congregational point of view. That's another way. Let me explain what I mean by that. I believe that these 7 churches give us 7 types of church congregations that exist in God's church today. And I think every church congregation, wherever it may be around the globe, has elements of all these 7 churches in them. Yeah, unfortunately, we know for certain that most of them today will be more like that last church in particular than all of the other 6 churches combined. And so not only do we need to look at ourselves as individuals, but painfully as it might be, we also need to look at our own congregation as a whole. And dare I say it, even our world church organization. So mostly let us examine ourselves, but also let us reflect on our own local church congregation. And those of you watching who are members of other churches, you need to examine your congregation too. And decide how these 7 churches and 7 letters that we will be studying apply to your particular situation. And as we go from week to week, just ask yourself the question: is my church an Ephesus congregation? Is my church a Smyrna congregation? Is my church a Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis congregation? Is my church a Philadelphian church? Or is my church a Laodicean church? Well, of course we've got a Laodicean church, Pastor John. We're Laodiceans. We're the seventh and last church. Okay, you got a point. Granted, we are the last church before Jesus returns. But that doesn't mean we have to suffer from the Laodicean condition or act like Laodiceans or be lukewarm like Laodiceans. I mean, just because we are Laodiceans doesn't mean we have to act like Laodiceans. Like a friend of mine had to be admitted into the hospital, but they had no beds, and the only thing available was on the psych ward. So that's where they had to put him. When I went to visit him and walked into his room, he started acting all goofy and crazy, and we had a good laugh. But just because he had to be in the crazy ward didn't mean he was crazy. And just because you have to be in the Laodicean church doesn't mean you have to suffer from the Laodicean condition. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. The next thing I want to talk about in these 7 churches is the location. Now, the Lord is very specific here in verse 11. He says, write a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia. So where are the churches? Asia. Okay, that's very specific. These churches had a definite geographical location. They were in Asia. And that was one of the provinces of the Roman Empire. And today, that's the modern country of Turkey. And that's where these 7 churches existed, in Asia, in what is now Turkey. It was approximately in 96 AD when John wrote these words, and it was a time when the Roman Empire was in total domination. Now, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, the light of Christian witness, for the most part, moved from Jerusalem to Asia. And the stronghold of the Christian faith in that particular era was in Asia. So the culture and the atmosphere of the Roman Empire is what dominated those places where those new Christian churches were located. Now, as you look at the location, you have to keep in mind that over 2,000 years later, the Christian churches of the 21st century are also in particular locations, and the Christian churches of the 21st century also find themselves in a particular culture and atmosphere, and the atmosphere and the culture and the locations and the churches today are all important as we seek to be what God has called us to be and commanded us to be. Okay, I now want to put some words together to help us to give us a little taste of the location of the churches of Asia, and also help us to relate that same kind of thing to the location of the churches and what we're facing today in the 21st century. The first 2 words I want us to put together are prosperity and poverty. Prosperity and poverty. In the 1st century AD, at the time of the early Christian church in Asia, in the Roman Empire, there was a combination of prosperity on one end of the social spectrum and poverty on the other. And there seemed to be no middle class. The Roman Empire at this particular time had come to the zenith of its power and its wealth by means of military conquest and commerce. So there was in the Roman Empire an upper ruling class, and this upper ruling class was lavishly wealthy.